Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video I would like to continue with our Primarch Project deep dives by going into the 8th Primarch Project, who would be designated Night Haunter. For the list of correspondences for this Primarch Project number 8's designated name would be both Night Haunter and Konrad Curze. The aspect of humanity that I assign to the Primarch is darkness. The Legion Specialization is psychological warfare and terrorism, and the Geneseed organ that I most associate with the Primarch Project and the Legion under them is the Occulobe. Project number 8's gestation pod would land on the hive world of Nostromo. Nostromo was a dark and bleak world for a variety of reasons. First, the star of the solar system that the planet Nostromo was in was dying, and its light could barely reach the planet. What light did reach the planet could not penetrate its thick atmosphere of gases. These were not naturally occurring gases, but the fumes and exhaust of industrial production. The whole of Nostromo was mostly uninhabitable except for near the equator of the planet. So the human population on the world, which numbered in the several billions, settled on the equator into one of 5 semi-independent hive cities. The environment of these hives were depressing to say in the least. The hive cities themselves were dark realms of stone and metal in which the lower class citizenry toiled away in the mines of each. Nostromo was a world that was naturally abundant in the metal known as adamantium, one of the strongest metals in the 40k universe. Naturally, it put Nostromo in a good position to trade with other nearby systems and accumulate wealth. However, it also caused 3 unique problems. The first problem was the pollution. The chem factories and manufactorums in each of the 5 hive cities constantly belched out thick clouds of pollution into the atmosphere. So layered had the atmosphere become with pollution that what little sunlight from Nostromo's dying star that did reach the planet couldn't penetrate through its atmosphere, which made Nostromo an even more physically dark and bleak place. There was barely a difference between night and day on the world, and the difference between the two was only visually a few shades of gray. This dark environment actually shaped the Nostroman population, imbuing them with pale skin, and over the course of many generations, Nostromans developed large pupils to be better able to see in the dark environment. This made Nostromans appear to have pale albino-like skin and black eyes. Now this is interesting because these traits were passed on to offspring, and the Nostroman population were isolated on this world, which means technically this could have potentially made Nostromans a minor form of a type of abhuman known as Nightsiders or Homo sapiens tenebris, which are humans who evolved to be able to survive on extremely dark worlds. But at this time in Imperial history, uniting humanity took precedent over classifying humanity for the most part, so these adaptations to their environment were seen simply as adaptations and nothing more. The second problem was the corruption. Those of high political position in each of the hives were corrupt individuals who worked the populations in the hives tirelessly, barely paying them for their labor or not paying them at all. There were no safety protocols enforced in the adamantium mines or in the processing manufactorums, and so injury and casualty in the conditions were a regular occurrence. Not only that, but Nostromo was a place run by crime, extortion, and violence. The stark contrast between the wealthy elite and the poor working class led to a variety of societal outcomes, some of which included the formation of street gangs that preyed on the lower class and often worked for the higher class, who would use them to squeeze out what earnings the lower class made from their work. It led to the unchecked nature of criminal behavior, assault, and lawlessness, a generalized indifference of the upper class toward the lower class, and an indifference from the lower class toward life. That last part was the third problem of Nostromo. On a planet where sunlight's rays could not reach through the world's toxic atmosphere and left it in perpetual darkness, on a world where as a regular citizen you were forced to slave away in unsafe mines and manufactorums with little pay, only to have what little payment made be extorted and taken from you by thugs and criminals, on a world where it was more profitable to be a gang member stealing from others than it was to earn an honest living through work and industry, on a world where one's end could come quickly and suddenly from being robbed, shot, or stabbed to death, or otherwise slowly and over time through consumption of the lungs. In a world where most births were the result of sexual assault. On a world such as this, the majority of deaths that occurred were the result of suicide. It was such a common practice that it was also seen as a kind of natural occurrence and kind of self-prescribed population control. The 8th Primarch Project's pod would land on this bleak and dismal world. Primarch Project number 8 grew to maturity alone. No one adopted him as their own. No one brought him to the rest of the tribe or the brotherhood or the clan. He wasn't found by anyone. His pod impacted Nostromo with such violence that it went through the surface and buried into its core. Accounts say that when he emerged from his pod, he had to swim through the molten core of Nostromo and crawl to the surface. When the project finally emerged on the surface, it was as a child in isolation. His pod landed in Hive Quintus on the world, and it was there that he was forced to survive. More than Lehman Russ, who was raised by Fenrisian wolves, and more than Lionel Johnson, who grew in the chaos beast-infested forests of Caliban, the 8th Primarch Project truly grew into adulthood like an animal would, surviving in whatever ways he could amongst the truly human beasts of Nostromo, learning from the world he found himself in and being shaped by it along the way. It is recorded that the Primarch first lived as a scavenger in the broken down buildings of the Hive City as an infant. In these early years, he survived off of will and determination. He hunted the feral animals that wandered into the Hive City in order to feed himself, sometimes eating the dead bodies of both animal and Nostromens alike. He avoided interaction with the humans of the world by keeping to the shadows until much later in his life, and during this time he also killed, though mostly out of self-defense toward those who would attempt to harm him. Eventually, the Primarch began to understand that he was essentially different from those who tried to prey on him. He was stronger and faster and more deadly with his hands and teeth. Through his eating of the dead to survive as a youth, he acquired the knowledge of those he consumed and the darkness of their experiences. He learned of murder and crime and wrongdoing from this consumption, but also from witnessing it around him. Eventually, after seeing how the world worked around him, the crime and the cruelty, the violence and the dread, he began to participate in it. However, the way he would participate in it was driven by an internal sense of justice and order. But concepts like justice and order on a world such as Nostromo naturally came with implications of fear and vengeance. The 8th Primarch Project began to murder. At first, it was in response to witnessing an injustice, but then the criminal elements of Hive Quintus were murdered. This would cause him to be hunted by the gangs hired by the government officials. He would slaughter all but a few, and those he spared, he only did so that they could go back to their employers with the message that he was coming for them, a statement that would become a motto later in his life. Then, as the slaughter progressed, his reasons for murder became more subjective and based on his interpretations of a transgression, whether or not an actual transgression actually occurred. Suicide became a sin to the Primarch Project's eyes, and he would murder anyone who he saw attempting it, killing them eventually, but not quickly or painlessly like how the person attempting it might have wanted to end their own life. Murder is the clean way of saying what he did. In reality, he brutalized his victims to death, faces smashed into a pulp, bodies flayed and hung in areas where they could be publicly seen, dismemberment and body parts scattered throughout the city. Sometimes the bodies wouldn't even be identifiable, but often they were, in some way or form, left in a certain way as a message. Those who spoke against him and his work promptly went missing, only to have their corpses found in some horrible fashion. The effect that this had on the Hive City was dramatic and extreme. actual crime went down to near zero. For the first time in a very long time, the population of Hive Quintus experienced the semblance of order through fear of what would happen to them if they regressed back to their old ways. This fear spread throughout the other 4 hive cities on the planet and imposed order onto them as well. It was a new era of Nostromo, one the likes of which the population had never experienced before. It was during this time that the 8th Primarch Project emerged from the darkness to rule Hive Quintus, and by extension of fear, the rest of the hives of Nostromo, as its Dark King. The 8th Primarch Project would rule Nostromo with both wisdom and startling acts of cruelty and violence. In times of cooperation with the law, he was beneficial, even-tempered, and wise. In times of deviation from law, he would personally hunt down anyone who broke the newly established laws of Nostromo and would make examples out of them and their corpses. Through his rule, Nostromo's trade with other systems increased significantly since it was not dominated by corruption but was instead guided by principles of fairness and honesty. For a time, the populations that once slaved themselves in the factories experienced a better, safer quality of life, and their character as a peoples excelled. Being that the 8th Primarch was not taken into a familial group of humans as a youth, he was never actually given a name like the Primarch Projects were that we've went over before. However, if we follow the tradition of the groups of humanity bestowing a name onto the Primarchs like the ones that we've went over previously, then the 8th Primarch was actually given a name by those who lived on Nostromo, but the name was more of a title. The name he was given was Night Haunter, and it was a name that he would accept as his own. However, that was not his true name. The growing Imperium of Man had begun trading with Nostromo well before anyone knew that one of the Primarch projects had landed on it. But when it was discovered, the Emperor himself journeyed to Nostromo, accompanied by other Primarch projects, namely Rogel Dorn, Ferrus Manus, and Logar. As the Emperor walked down the streets of Hive Quintus, his radiant glory and the glory of those who walked besides him shocked those of the bleak world. So accustomed were they to the darkness of the planet that those who looked at the Emperor directly went blind. Many ran from the procession of the Master of Mankind and his company. Others cried in fear. Awaiting them was the Night Haunter, who also had an interesting reaction to the entourage. It is said that Night Haunter had a vision of each of the other Primarch's futures, 2 deaths and 1 transformation. When he looked at the Emperor, he succumbed to a vision of the future that was so horrible that he attempted to claw out his own eyes. He was stopped from the action by the Emperor, who placed his hand on Haunter's head, removing the pain he was experiencing there due to the vision. The Emperor spoke to him then and said, "Be at peace, Konrad Curze. I have arrived and I intend to take you home." To this, the Primarch Project replied, "That is not my name, Father. My people have given me a name and I will bear it until my dying day. And I know full well what you intend for me." Haunter, or Curze as he had been called by the Emperor, declared loyalty to the Emperor, but it is said that he did so almost begrudgingly, as if he had to, or as if he was playing a part in a vision he had had previously. Night Haunter would be taken under the tutelage of another Primarch project, Fulgrim, Primarch of the 3rd Legion, to learn from him about the Imperium of Man, its history, and the organization of the Astartes legions. Now, I've just pointed out a few very important things. First, the Emperor named the 8th Primarch Project. It is a common theme that the Emperor had a plan for each of the Primarchs and knew what their natures were to be at their core. However, the Emperor himself named the 8th Primarch Konrad Curze. It is officially unknown what this name means or the significance of it, but theories abound that the name has an ancient Terran origin. The rumors say that it is an amalgamation of a name of a Terran dramaturge and a figure that the dramaturge wrote about in his works. The name was a byword for madness and the heart of darkness. It was a name that the Haunter rejected for the name that he had been given by the Nostramans. Night Haunter rejecting the name given to him by the Emperor would be the only defiance to fate that he would express after this occurrence. The second thing this pointed out was the significance of Night Haunter's visions. The 8th Primarch Project was known to have visions of the future of two specific types. The first type was seeing the future as it was. The second type was to see the worst possible future. He received visions of both kinds, though he could not tell one from the other, and he was not personally aware that some of the visions that he had were the worst possible option. It is said that the ability to see the future in a true sense was an ability imbued into him by the Emperor in his creation. But regardless of where it came from, these visions that he received were true and factual in nature. When Haunter saw the death of Rogel Dorn and Ferrus Manus, they came to pass, as well as the transformation of Fulgrim, all in the way that he visualized. These were true visions. But if Haunter received these visions and they were true as an ability incorporated into his creation, then where did the other fatalistic category of his visions originate? I theorize that if they do have a distinct origin separate from what was imbued within him, another possibility is that they came from Haunter's eating of the dead on Nostromo during his youth. Adeptus Astartes have an organ which allows the Astartes to gain information from the flesh through consumption. While it is unknown if Primarchs actually had Geneseed organs, this is one example that shows that they possessed the inherent functions of Geneseed organs as part of their natural physiology. Night Haunter ate the dead bodies of Nostramans in his youth, and it's through their flesh that he learned about human life on Nostromo. It's unknown just how many carcasses he ate, or how many it would take to have an effect on him and his visions. However, devouring Nostraman flesh while having an ability, a natural proclivity for prophetic visions, could have warped the quality of his visions. In learning their lives, he could have learned their dark past and their dark potential. On a world like Nostromo, where the majority of the human population were guilty of some kind of injustice or wrongdoing, this repeated theme could have flavored his thoughts and his visions. That is, of course, only a theory. The initial recruits for the 8th Legion were taken from a region on Terra known as Old Albia. Old Albia bordered on the northern Atland, which in modern times would be the northern Atlantic. According to available information, Old Albia was once the location of the British Isles in Terra's ancient past. Old Albia was a techno-barbarian nation-state that was known for its strength and power during the Age of Strife. Composed of proud, warlike clans and having previously fought against tyrants in its past, Old Albia would refuse to join the Emperor's cause and would fight against him. Against his Thunder Legions, they deployed their own proto-dreadnoughts and Ironside soldiers, which reaped a fearsome tally from the Emperor's forces, even at the cost of many of their own. Each time the Emperor attacked, the Albion forces would repel him. The fighting was so bad that the Emperor had to change his tactics. He declared a ceasefire and appeared before the clan warlords unarmed and unarmored, in robes of cream and red, the colors of ancient Albia. He spoke of his ideals for humanity and his plans for unification, offering them glory and expansion into the galaxy. The clan lords were convinced and became some of the strongest supporters of the unification after this. Working with the Emperor of Mankind, the Albion clan lords provided some of the initial recruits for the legions which would later be known as the 14th Legion, the 10th Legion, and the 8th Legion. The initial recruits for the 8th Legion came specifically from the underground interconnected prison sinks that existed underneath Old Albia but which extended further from that region. In these subterranean caverns and networks lived peoples who had at one point been condemned to never see the light of day or breathe free air, as they were imprisoned under the surface of the earth for transgressions they committed. With time, the civilizations that imprisoned them rose and fell, and these prison sinks fell to ruin eventually, but the human population that had once inhabited them stayed in these underground environments. Some of the worst that humanity had to offer existed in these underground kingdoms. It was dominated by lawlessness, violence, and misrule. Only the most brutal, the most cunning, and the most cruel survived amongst them. From this population, children were born. These children were extremely pale and silent creatures, true inheritors of the lightless realm that they were born in. They were called Night's Children by the prisoner population, and they were feared. It is from amongst these children that the Emperor would select the first recruits of the 8th Legion, imbuing them with the Geneseed of the 8th Primarch Project. The Astartes of the 8th Legion were vastly different from their brother legions. The combination of physical inheritance and Geneseed imbued them with pale skin and fully black eyes. They were possessed of an enhanced sensitivity to light, and because of this, they had to see the world through the visors of their helms, with its buffers and filters. Eventually, for the sake of their effectiveness, they began to only be deployed at night or in times of darkness. The Emperor deployed the legionnaires of the 8th Legion as a form of retribution against those previously techno-barbarian states which had sworn loyalty to the Imperium of Man and fealty to the Emperor, but who had in secret regressed back to their pre-unification ways, thinking that the Imperium would eventually fall. The 8th Legion developed a sense of moral absolutism. To them, there was no shades of gray. Matters were black and white, and things like guilt and past transgressions would come to the light by the 8th Legion through their grisly work conducted in the dark. The Legion's specialization of war was psychological warfare and terrorism. The Emperor deployed the 8th Legion for this specific purpose. The 8th Legion were killers and butchers. They frequently made examples of the forces that they engaged in as a message to those who would see the aftermath of their legion's work. Conclaves and warlords and forces were slaughtered with the coming of the night, and the next day their mutilated carcasses were left to rot and bloat. Even before being reunited with their Primarch, the 8th Legion weaponized fear and horror to benefit the goals of the Imperium of Man and the Great Crusade. At this time in their history, the armor of the 8th Legion was a dark midnight blue with a silver trim. The early Legion heraldry was a red winged skull, the symbol itself a representation of the statement Memento Mori, the statement meaning remember you must die, and its design was specifically originated from the ruined and once sacred structures of ancient Albia. Even during this time in their history, the 8th utilized visually disturbing elements to their armor, such as skull designs on their helmets or faceplates that seemed to weep blood, but this was kept largely symbolic during this time. Before they were reunited with their Primarch, the 8th Legion was known and referred to simply as the 8th. It was both after Nighthauntr took leadership of his legion and he began recruiting from Nostromo that the aesthetic began to change in a more literal direction. Nighthauntr changed the name of his legion from its numeral designation to the Night Lord's Legion. Nighthauntr wanted the best and brightest of Nostromo to be recruited into his legion, which was a possible thing due to Hauntr's rule of Nostromo, during which crime was reduced to zero. But when he had left Nostromo to learn about the Imperium and be reunited with his legion on Terra, Nostromo regressed back to the violence-infested, criminal world of darkness that it had been before the rule of the 8th Primarch Project. This was not recognized immediately, and by the time it was too late. The rulers of the hives of Nostromo had begun sending not the best of Nostromo as recruits to the 8th Legion, but the worst, basically emptying the world's prisons into the Legion recruit tithes and saving the best for the street gangs that worked for them. Slowly but surely, the aesthetics of the Legion began to change, as did its nature. Nighthauntr himself began and encouraged the accumulation of grisly trophies being displayed on the armor of the 8th Legion, as they were useful for inspiring fear to the enemy. He also incorporated the lightning effects on their armor of the Legion. The exact meaning behind the lightning effects is unknown, though not specifically stated in any official lore. I theorize that the lightning effects were symbolic of the Unification Wars and were the 8th Legion's variation of the Unification War lightning bolt, made into a living design that danced across the armor. In dark environments, these designs turned the legionnaires of the 8th Legion into ghostly specters of unification. The heraldry of the Legion changed slightly. The wings became fuller and the skull design changed. Gold and brass trim began to be a common sight amongst the Legion as well. Over time, more and more Nostraman runes started to be used, and then Nostraman gang signs and symbology as the ranks began to swell with prison gang members and criminals from Nostromo. The nature of the Legion began to change as well. The 8th Legion had always been known for the excessive massacre they left behind in their wake, but it was largely done in symbolic warning and display to scare those who thought of straying from the dictates of the growing Imperium. The macabre results of the 8th style of war served a nobler cause and ideal. The fates of those who the 8th were sent to massacre were set in stone, and so their deaths were made into a firm example of what would happen should they be sent after another population. Similar to the Night Hunter's murders during his youth, the technique was meant to cause fear, and through fear, compliance. Similar to the 6th Legion when they were known as the Rout, the 8th Legion was used largely in compliance actions. However, the difference was that the 8th were deployed not when compliance was needed, but when compliance was betrayed. As the ranks of the Legion began to swell with those criminally regressed Nostramans, slaughter and murder became objectives within themselves, and it became less about reinforcing the rule and authority of the Imperium, but more about killing for the sake of killing, for the superiority of it, for the pleasure of it. The Night Lord's Legion spread out into the galaxy as a grim shadow of the Great Crusade that attacked and slaughtered populations for the slightest of infractions or disobedience to the Emperor's decree. At first, the Emperor would deploy the Legion where he felt it was needed, and all it took was word to spread of the 8th Legion's atrocities for fear to spread and compliance to be resumed. Then, as he took command of his Legion, Night Haunter would decide where the Legion was best deployed. Under his command, the 8th Legion would accept no declarations of subjugation or surrender from those that they were deployed against, and none were spared the judgment for non-compliance. Whereas the nature of the 8th Legion's work had always been one of shadows, darkness, and the hidden blade, this became a defining tactic of the 8th Legion with time. Similar to how the Rout would only become empowered after the enemy was already broken, the Night Lords would only engage in fights that they knew they could win. They would strike rapidly at points of weakness in the enemy's forces, utilizing shock and fear, then regress, watching their prey from the dark before attacking at another angle and weakening them further, and doing this repeatedly until their enemy was broken. Units such as terror squads were used in large numbers. Terror squads were composed of the most deranged of the 8th Legion, mutilators, flayers, torturers, all of whom bore the symbol of the Red Gauntlet, which symbolized those Astartes marked for death for their depravity by their Primarch. The number of terror squads increased due to the increase in the prison population of Nostromo in the Legion. The use of raptors became popular as well, close combat oriented troops that were equipped with jump packs and were considered an elite fighting force. Over time, Night Haunter began to spiral in hate and disgust toward his Legion when he began to realize what they were becoming. This hate and disgust would also be directed at his brother Primarchs, which would lead to conflicts with Rogel Dorn, Lionel Johnson, and Vulcan, to name a few. His hate and disgust would also eventually be projected at the Emperor and even at himself. Haunter was not comfortable as the war leader of a legion during the Great Crusade and shunned the company of his brother Primarchs during most of it. Though he preferred the company of his own legion, he had no affection for them, even though they were his sons. Throughout the Great Crusade, Haunter and the Night Lord's Legion would descend further and further into debauchery and murder, and it would eventually culminate to the Hunter siding with the traitors during the Horus Heresy. After violent conflicts with his brothers, Haunter and his legion would be censured. The Primarch was captured and arrested to be brought before the Emperor to face judgment. However, Night Haunter would escape his confines, gather his legion, and spiral even further into darkness. When Haunter was finally made aware that corruption had returned to Nostromo, he took his legion to the world and slaughtered the majority of its population before destroying the planet by targeting its weak point with cyclonic missiles. By regressing back to the old ways of Nostromo, they had signed their own death warrants by the dictates of the Legion. The fact that it was his own homeworld that he was attacking meant little to him. They would pay for their regression, but in doing so, he crossed the line of no return, or at least he felt he did. In this, his reaction was similar to Perturabo of the 4th Legion. It may have very well been the case that the Emperor would have forgiven both Primarchs for the rectification of their homeworlds, but both felt that they would not be the case. The aspect of humanity that I assign to the 8th Primarch Project is darkness. By darkness, I mean all the aspects of human nature that are regulated to the unseen, those aspects hidden beneath the visage of humanity and benevolence, emotions like fear and shame, ignorance, cruelty, superiority, meanness, and hopelessness, those crown virtues which support and fuel the drive behind murder, lawlessness, and extortion. Though we still have quite a few Primarch projects to look into, I think the 8th Primarch Project, more than any of the other projects, embodied the evil of human nature. Night Haunter is a complex Primarch project. There are two themes that flavor their perspective and outlook, which make him unique amongst the other Primarchs that are worth noting, and which makes him, at his very base, evil. Konrad Curze's worldview had elements of both fatalism and naturalism. Fatalism is the belief that all things are predetermined and therefore inevitable. It can be said that Haunter could not help but believe this as he experienced visions of the future that would come to pass, and having experienced this multiple times, it could make one believe that all things followed a trajectory outside of anyone's control. Fatalism by itself is passive acceptance, not necessarily negative in nature. What made Night Haunter's version of fatalism dark was its combination with naturalism. Naturalism, at least as a literary tradition, is a style of writing that emphasizes the personal character and development are shaped by social conditions, hereditary factors, and environmental aspects, all of which have an inescapable influence on who people become. A theme that is repeated in Haunter's story is that he and his legion were shaped into what they were by external forces. The environment of Nostromo, its darkness and its material wealth, shaped the humans of the world to be filled with greed and drawn toward violence and lawlessness. Haunter was created by the Emperor, his nature selected and weaponized, imbued with transhuman power without his choice in the matter. The Primarch would land on a world chosen by powers outside of his control or understanding. He would grow and learn from the world out of survival, and his understanding of the world and things was influenced by it. The initial recruits for his legion were chosen from a specific kind of population and used specifically toward a certain aim of murder. Almost all that he was physically and who he was as an individual were in some way or form predetermined in a way that seemed like fate, and that predetermined fate was that of darkness, both literally through a physical sensitivity to light having adapted to dark environments, and figuratively through being used as a form of retribution and tool of fear unsheathed in the dark. Haunter, or Konrad Curze, embodied the darkness of humanity, embodied cruelty, guilt, and projection, the weight of past transgressions, the darkness of fear, and according to him, none of those things were up to him. In his view, for all intent and purpose, he was made to be what he was and had no more power to stop it, as he had no power to reject it either. These views, combined with Haunter's experiences, imbued him with a sense of hopelessness and dread which set him apart from the other Primarch projects. Viewing it from this perspective, it is really no wonder that Haunter would turn against the Imperium of Man and the Emperor, siding with the traitors during the Horus Heresy. The ancient Stoics of Terra had a quote which said that evil does not exist naturally in the world but comes about as a result of laziness and forgetfulness toward one's purpose. In the case of Night Haunter, he did not try to overcome these feelings of dread that he was experiencing. He passively accepted everything that he was, and this is what made him, at his core, evil. When Haunter began having visions of the Horus Heresy before it happened, he confided this information to Fulgrim, who confided this information to Dorn. Dorn took offense to these views and confronted Haunter. Haunter attacked Dorn, ripping out pieces of his flesh from his abdomen, knocking him unconscious and nearly killing him. When Haunter was found, he was found crying over Dorn's body. Why was he crying? Because his visions were becoming true and he had a part in fulfilling them, the worst part. In regards to Haunter's destruction of Nostromo, some blamed the Emperor for what happened to Nostromo. If he hadn't have taken the Night Haunter from the world, Nostromo would have remained a just place. Some blamed Night Haunter, saying that if he never left, Nostromo might have never unraveled. Those skeletal fingers could be pointed in a variety of directions in an attempt to blame the degradation of the world, of the Primarch, and of the Legion toward crime and lawlessness. The overwhelming fact remained obvious. Compliance through fear was always a temporary compliance that needed to be maintained by consistent presence and application. This is one of the reasons why the 8th Legion was not made for the future of the Great Crusade. They would have to spend more time policing the Imperium rather than uniting humanity. They would be the afterthought of compliance, only necessary when compliance was deviated from. But the Great Crusade was about more than just compliance. It was driven by higher ideals than subjugation and slaughter. But the circumstances that shaped the 8th Legion made them little more than tools of those things. That they were created and useful to the Emperor at all revealed a hidden aspect to both the Emperor and the Crusade. The Emperor could not unite humanity through conquest and idealism alone. He could not rule through honor and righteousness only. Fear and ruthlessness were tools that were necessary as well. Night Haunter and his Legion embodied those things. Throughout the Great Crusade, the Emperor saw the devolution of the 8th Primarch and his Legion, but did little to actually stop them for that reason. They were simply as he intended them to be. The only time actual punishment was threatened was when Night Haunter nearly committed fratricide by almost killing Dorn. I want to point out that it's almost like a play in how Night Haunter's interactions were with his brother Primarchs in regards to what each of them represented. How it was Dorn, Ferris, and Logar who went to meet Night Haunter for the first time upon Nostromo. How it was from Fulgrim, the embodiment of culture, that Night Haunter learned about the Imperium and the Legion Astartes. How it was Dorn, the paragon of the Great Crusade, that Night Haunter almost killed. How it was Lionel Johnson, the embodiment of pride, that captured Curze. How it was Sanguinius who tried to convince Haunter that his worldview was flawed, and how it was Vulcan that Curze would kill repeatedly. When you think about what he represented and what those Primarchs he conflicted with represented, it's almost like a play. Darkness learns from culture. Darkness almost kills the Great Crusade. Darkness is captured by pride. Hope tries to convince darkness from his path. Humanity is killed by darkness multiple times. It's almost like a metaphor, it's almost like a story that we're being shown through the storylines of these Primarchs and their interactions. Nighthunter began to lose his belief that things were predetermined the more he interacted with his brothers. In certain circumstances, something happened that he did not see happening in his visions, or things would go in a different way to how he visualized it. Even when he was used by his brothers for his ability, his visions would at times yield no result. Whether he was aware of it or not, so strongly had he believed in predetermined fate, but so consistently had he begun to be proven wrong that he began to orchestrate the futures he visualized. The orchestration of his own death was perhaps the most direct expression of this. Nighthunter had seen in a vision that he was to be killed, and so he made it possible for it to be done. The Emperor sent assassins to kill the 8th Primarch Project, and when the assassins arrived, Hunter had ordered his Astartes to let the assassin kill him. His last words spoke of having known that the assassins would arrive and how their presence affirmed all that he had ever believed. At that, he said, "Death is nothing compared to vindication," before he was killed. The statement is considered one of the most puzzling enigmas spoken by any Primarch, but considering all the factors in his death, I interpret the statement in a certain way. Death is often seen, especially in the case of the 8th Primarch and his legion, as a form of punishment. Vindication is to be cleared of suspicion and blame. Death being compared as minor in comparison to vindication is essentially saying that vindication is the worser fate, the greater punishment of the two. It goes back to a conversation that Curze had with the Emperor before he was killed. Before Nighthunter's assassination, he made a grisly effigy of the Emperor using stitched together corpses and had a quote-unquote conversation with the Emperor through it. In the conversation, the Emperor told Hunter that his nature was as he intended it to be up until a certain point. The Emperor told him that regardless of what he was made to be, he chose his own path by believing in immutable fate. The Emperor told Hunter that he forgave him. That forgiveness, that vindication, was something that the 8th Primarch could not take, could not accept. And this is truly why the Nighthunter was killed. He believed it to be the only way. It was possible for Nighthunter to have killed the assassin sent to kill him, but he let his own death occur out of a belief that it was not only inevitable, but just. Death is nothing compared to vindication. To be forgiven for one's wrongdoings was worse than death for those wrongdoings, a motto the Legion had built itself around since its inception. Unfortunately, the truth was that, like the name given to him by the Emperor, the 8th Primarch Project was the author and the character in his own tragedy. That the Emperor sought only to kill the Primarch of the 8th Legion rather than destroy the entire Night Lord's Legion speaks to their usefulness to him. If they had not sided with the traitors, they likely would have suffered the same fate as one of the missing Primarchs and would have been incorporated into another legion, likely the Raven Guard. The Geneseed organ that I most associate with the 8th Primarch Project and his legion is the Occulobe. Despite the pale-skinned and black-eyed visual appearance of the Astartes made from the Geneseed made from the 8th Primarch Project was stable and had no defects. However, the Geneseed imbued the Astartes of the 8th Legion with the ability to see perfectly in near pitch-black conditions. If that ability can be associated with a Geneseed organ, it would be the Occulobe. The Occulobe is one of the Geneseed organs implanted into an Astartes during their transformation from human into Astartes. It's also called the Eye of Vengeance. It is implanted along the optic nerve and sits at the base of the brain. Once this organ is implanted, the recruit usually undergoes optic therapy intended to increase their eye growth patterns and their light receptive cells. to the point that Astartes have far superior vision in low-lit areas in comparison to baseline humans. The 8th Legion Geneseed seemingly enhanced this receptivity to the point that Astartes of the 8th Legion both saw clearly in dark environments and struggled to see in well-lit environments, forcing them to rely on the lenses of their helms for protection in unfavorable conditions. But I'd also like to say that the 8th Legion is only one example of why we should rethink commonly attributed effects of the Geneseed on human recruits and our ideas of where these effects originate. The Emperor didn't know where the Primarchs would land, so the likelihood that Night Haunter was made to have pale skin and black eyes is actually pretty low. It is likely that Night Haunter looked completely different and would have looked different if he had landed on a different world, but as I said in previous videos, the Primarchs likely changed themselves physiologically and likely involuntarily when they were young to fit in with the human populations on the worlds on which they would land and to survive in the environments they lived in. If there is any proof that this was the case with Night Haunter, it is that Nostrumans developed these traits over generations, and it only took him years at most to have pale skin that the world bestowed upon its population and to have large pupils that would make his eyes appear fully black, even though they actually weren't. Night Haunter still had the whites to his eyes. It just wasn't seen unless he opened his eyes wide enough, unlike actual Nostrumans who had fully black eyes and whose pupils covered the entirety of the visible parts of their eyes. However, even if Haunter would have looked different, the initial recruits to the Legion all had pale skin, but this was from their human heritage, from the populations that lived underground in the underground prison sinks, the Night's Children who had pale skin. When Nostrumans began to be recruited to the Legion, they already had pale skin and black eyes. And yet, even into the 40th millennium, those Night Lord recruits to the Legion would all have black-looking eyes and pale skin. This means that the 8th Primarch Project's Geneseed did not imbue these traits onto the recruits of the Legion, but rather the opposite. The recruits imbued these traits onto the Geneseed. If you've ever wondered why the Emperor chose the initial recruits of each legion from specific places and populations, this is why, so their traits would be imprinted onto the Geneseed. This is why the initial recruits for the Angels of Death were the physically purest Orn Terra, why the initial recruits for the 3rd Legion were Terran nobility, while the initial recruits for the 4th were from the gun tribes and tech enclaves of Sek Amrak, why the 5th were from survivalists, why the 6th were the most aggressive, why the 7th were the physically toughest, and why the 8th were the most evil. Keep this in mind as we move forward with the rest of the Primarch Project videos. And that has been my deep dive into the 8th Primarch Project designated Night Haunter or Konrad Curze. Without anything else to be said, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.